Okay, YouTube is up and running. Okay, you almost ready?
I'm ready, yeah.
Super. I'm going to turn that off. Hello, welcome people. We've got lots of people coming into the room today. Hello to Elle, hello to Esther, hello to Jessica, Sophia, Sophie, Tish. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're going to just quickly pop a little question for you into the chat box. Take a look at the chat box. Introduce yourself, your role, your student union, something you're looking forward to this weekend. This session will kick off at 25 to. So we're just going to wait for everyone to get in. It's quite a large session today. It's a really popular session, and we're really grateful that it's going to be able to be run through our conference. We've got over 60 people registered for this one. And there's already 31 in the room. So take a look in the chat, introduce yourself and find out a little bit more about each other. I can see, I think it's Dia from De Montfort. She's the Equality and Diversity Exec. We've also got Asha, Welfare Officer from Gloucestershire. Hello, good to meet you both. So lots more introductions, please, in the chat box, and we will be getting started in about 3 minutes. Hello, Joanna. Again, De Montfort. De Montfort's everywhere. Loving it. Emmy Lane, VP Welfare, University of Derby. Excellent. Megan, VP Welfare and Community at Bath Spa. Bliss, University of Leicester. Do we have anyone from the nations? Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, are you here? We had some people from South Island earlier. We've got Elle, Activities Officer at Leicester. Debbie, BME, Liberation Officer at Imperial. Make sure you join our WhatsApp groups, by the way, if you're a student officer. We've got lots of WhatsApp groups, they're very active. Pop in there, say hello. The WhatsApp groups will last all year long, so that you can meet and talk with other sabbaticals doing your role or roles. So we've got everything in there, including one for liberation officers, if you're a liberation officer. Esther from Greenwich. Hey. So although I'm James J and I work for Coventry, I'm actually based in London. So it's good to see the London contingent turning out. Miriam from Strathclyde. Laura, again from De Montfort. Jessica, Community Action Manager at the Union Man Net. Oh, I love your building, it's beautiful. Charlotte from BPP. Hi, Charlotte. Adam from, I'm going to say this wrong, from Shrewsbury, not Shrewsbury. Sophia, Leeds. Oh, really good, split across the country. Howard, BME Officer at Cambridge. Ancient Universities. Who else have we got? Anyone else snuck in? Ben from De Montfort. Hello. Aisha from De Montfort. It's like we've got the entire SAB team here. Brilliant. Well, we all know what you'll be working on over the next year. So we've got about 30 seconds left. Great to have you all. We're up to about 40-ish attendees now. Super. Right, so hello everyone, welcome to this session on supporting students of colour's mental health. Delighted to introduce Sana Ali. She's the co-founder of Minds of POC, which is a developmental consultancy service designed to support the mental health of people of colour. Today's session is obviously really of the moment. we're all really deeply concerned across the entire student movement about the Black Lives Matters agenda, and also about mental health. So actually having these two agendas come and combined in today's webinar is a really useful tool, because I know many students' unions from across the country are looking at these issues and making sure that we're delivering the best services we can for our supporters and our members. We will be running through the presentation as a presentation, taking Q&As at the end. So if you've got any questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A box, and we'll either answer them live or via text response. So feel free to do that all the way through. Just to let you all know that we are live streaming this event onto YouTube and onto our website. So it is being recorded by us. So if you don't want to be seen, if you have got privacy related issues, please don't turn your camera on and don't turn your microphone on. You are in control of the way that you're presented online. So without any further ado, over to our guest speaker, who is going to lead us through this fantastic presentation for us today. Over to you.
Thank you, James, and thank you everybody who's attending. As James mentioned, I'm the co-founder of Minds of POC, but I also just finished my term as well-being officer at Leicester Students' Union. So I completely understand where all of you are coming from in terms of the context you're here, and the difficulties that come along with being a union officer or staff member. So I'm conscious of the time I have, so I'll just get started straight away. So the aim of today's session is, of course, to understand the difficulties of being a person of colour and how that translates into the university setting, and what you as union officers and staff members can do both by lobbying the university and what you can do in your own unions. So that will be done through addressing these 4 aims, which going through the workshop we'll go into more detail of for each one, and then hopefully leaving time for questions at the end as well. So the first aim is, of course, to address language around decolonisation. In your terms as officers,
Oh, we seem to be having some connection issues at the moment. Bear with us, everyone, one moment. Hello, everyone. There seems to be some sort of connection issue at the moment. So bear with us whilst we try and reconnect. Apologies about this. If you want to have a little chat in the chat box, that'd be great. And we will try and reconnect with our guest speaker, who I know was having a few connection problems earlier today. So do bear with us whilst we do that.
hello.
Hello.
Oh my God, I am so sorry. I think my internet cut out. That's so annoying.
Absolutely fine. It happens to all of us. So we got to your very first point on the presentation. So if you wouldn't mind starting from that point again, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, no, of course.
take a breath and let us know when you're doing it. I'll do some shout outs here. We got going on. We've got some questions from Debbie. Has said, have any of you unions done anything in terms of mental and emotional support following increased Black Lives Matter movement momentum? Yeah, I mean, it's taking a toll on a lot of people actually having to deal with quite a lot of this stuff. I'm sure that this will get touched on in the presentation. Hello, Hen, VP Wellbeing and Diversity at Royal Holloway. Okay, we're about there.
We're back.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. So I will turn my camera off and I'll let you continue.
Yeah, sorry about that, everybody. That's so annoying. I'm connected to my 4G now, so hopefully it won't drop out. But as I was saying, I'm not sure where I dropped out, but I'll just go from the beginning. So it's really important to understand a lot of these terms and very widely used language, because when it comes to your time as an officer or as a union staff member, there's a lot of widely used terms when it comes to having a more inclusive university and decolonisation in general. And so I thought it was important for you to know how us as Minds of POC define these terms, which is why we chose 4 specific terms just to kind of run through in this short presentation, because there are many more, but I want to just focus on these ones for now. So the first being, of course, decolonisation itself. So this is something that's widely used in regards mostly to the curriculum and education, but it is something that should be that should permeate everything at university and the union. So decolonisation is a process of freeing minds and structures from colonial ideology. It is interrogating assumptions and their origins within widely used models and frameworks. So if we apply this to a support context, we need to ensure that everything that's used within perhaps a counselling room, we question where that comes from and whether that is truly supporting students of colour. And of course, within the wider context of university, ensuring that we're always constantly questioning where knowledge comes from and how we got to that knowledge. Because of course, colonization was a violent history, but it's not just history. The effects of colonization are still felt and they still devastate communities to this day, which is why it's incredibly important that this takes forefront as it has been so far. Another term that's very important is, of course, the attainment or awarding gap. And so the attainment or awarding gap refers to the significant and persistent disparity in the awarding of degrees between different groups of students. Of course, within this context, we're talking specifically about the BAME awarding gap and then specifically the Black awarding gap as well. And at Leicester, we used awarding rather than attainment because awarding is related instead to the grade a student is awarded by the university, which puts the onus on the university, and it highlights the structural issue of attainment or awarding, rather than talking about attainment, which puts the onus on the student in terms of what grade they attain. So this is incredibly important, and I'd very much implore you at your unions to interrogate the language that you're using around the awarding gap and to perhaps use awarding rather than attainment, because it does highlight the structural issue rather than putting it down to the individual, which we know isn't the case. Now, particularly in regards to kind of talking about support, cultural competency is an incredibly important one, and it is one that thankfully has taken more of a forefront in when unions are having conversations with universities about how support should look and what this means and what it looks like. So cultural competency is not something that's stagnant. It's an active and ongoing developmental process of a service. And beyond just actively understanding the culturally informed worldview of their clients, counsellors and other support professionals should be constantly addressing their own assumptions around clients' behaviours, values and preconceived notions. As mentioned, this is incredibly important for university context, which we'll touch on later as well, because without culturally competent services, we're not properly providing for all of our students. I think a final and very important a term to define is whiteness. And I think this is a term that can often scare and make people uncomfortable. But I'd recommend for you, if you are a white person or anybody who feels uncomfortable by the term whiteness, to lean into that discomfort and understand where it comes from. So whiteness is, if we know race to be a social construct, which it is, then we understand that whiteness is a structure and tool that sets the standard to which society is held and the lens through which processes are created. It creates the other, which is not biologically based, but is based through a violent history. So whiteness, it's important to remember that when we talk about whiteness, we're talking about a structural issue and a political term. And it is a political structure which is exclusionary and perpetuates violent racism and racial violence in all its forms, including microaggressions and other forms of racism. It seeks to uphold existing power structures which require somebody to be at the bottom. So it's just important to remember that when we talk about whiteness, this is what we mean. It's more of a structural issue. So those are some important terms that we thought would be good for people in students' unions to know, whether you hear those terms through the union itself or through the university, or even from a student who's coming to you and wanting and lobbying for these issues. They're very important terms to know and to hopefully lobby on and implement into all your work. So the next one is, of course, understanding the difficulty students of colour face and how this manifests itself at university and how it affects them at university. I just want to highlight that obviously this is a very, very in-depth discussion. It could be a whole workshop on its own. Obviously, we've not got long left, so it's something that I'll just be going through briefly. But just important to remember that there's a lot more as well, more than just what I'm just saying in this workshop. So of course, racism is a massive issue that people of colour in general face, and then especially students of colour. Of course, when we talk about people of colour, what do we mean by that? What we mean by that is anybody of African, Caribbean, Asian, meaning both Southeast and Southeast Asian, and Arab descent. So using people of colour is a good way to identify groups that need and require help. So using students of colour is just a good way and a preferable way to BAME, which can often be misconstrued in terms of what it means. So in regards to individual racism, this is the type of racism an individual displays that can be subconsciously or consciously, and that can be overtly or covertly. There's a range of different ways racism can manifest in people, things such as obviously colour blindness, overt racism, and indeed microaggressions. And I think in particular, I want to focus on microaggressions because those are something that every person of colour, any marginalised group face, but of course within this context, people of colour face, and students of colour often face them at a higher rate at university because they are meeting people who may previously not have ever met a person of colour in their life. And they tend to be victim to microaggressions more at university than anywhere else. So what is a microaggression? A microaggression is a seemingly small, persistent verbal or environmental indignity. This can be intentional, unintentional, and they tend to communicate hostility and negative prejudicial views toward people of colour. I've put some examples here. Obviously, there are so many examples of microaggressions, and the reason I want to highlight microaggressions is because they're so commonplace doesn't mean that they're not harmful. If anything, this just highlights their harm due to how brushed off they can become. I'll later go into more detail about why microaggressions are so harmful. But it's important to always take microaggressions seriously and to always be checking ourselves and our biases to ensure we are not reproducing microaggressions and power structures within our own communications with people, especially with students of colour we're supposed to be helping. And the next form of racism, as a broad term, is of course institutional racism, and this goes beyond individual racism and is defined by the Macpherson report as a collective failure of an organisation to provide appropriate professional service to people because of their colour, culture, or ethnic origin. It can be seen or detected in processes, attitudes, and behaviour which discriminate through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, and thoughtlessness, and racist stereotyping which disadvantage minority ethnic people. It's incredibly important to remember that both the Students' Union and the university are institutions and therefore are victim to institutional racism, or perpetrators of institutional racism, I might just say, rather than victims. Manifestations of institutional racism in wider society are of course things such as the disproportionate use of stop and search and excessive force against young Black boys, and Black and brown people being less likely to be hired. Of course, talking within a specific university context, how does this manifest? And one of the most tangible ways, and obviously not the only way, but the most tangible way, is through the awarding gap, which is a manifestation of course, institutional and systemic racism. The awarding gap as it currently stands nationally is for BAME students 13%, However, for Black students, it is at an incredibly high 26%. And what this means is that Black students are 26% less likely to achieve a 2-1 or a first than their white counterparts. And this highlights a structural issue and is an issue of institutional racism, and one that we must face and address very seriously. Of course, this is something that you may have heard of before, or maybe something you're just coming across now, but it's incredibly important as well to break down into specifics and not just use the broad term BAME, but to identify where there are disproportionate effects on students, such as Black students, and to be able to implement direct and specific support for them. So how does this affect students' mental health? So of course, when students attend university, they attend in the context of their lived experiences, which means that they deal with not just university-based institutional racism and individual racism, but racism in wider society as well. And dealing with constant racism and invalidation is incredibly damaging to people's mental health. It has been found to increase stress, increase physical health difficulties, and increase mental health difficulties. And of course, dealing with racism constantly results in racial trauma. And racial trauma may be a new term that you've come across. And what racial trauma or race-based traumatic stress means is the mental or emotional injury caused by encounters with racism. So of course, we can think about this in terms of displays of overt racism. So if somebody is called a derogatory term in the streets, or if they're told to go back home, as an example of overt racism, and you'd think there'd be racial trauma there, but we must not discount the effects of microaggressions. So in his book, Resmi Menakhem talks about how trauma responses can be formed after long sequences of smaller wounds, and we can apply this very, very easily to microaggressions, which can be seen as long sequences of smaller wounds and something that people of color face on a daily basis. So you may think that when you say microaggression, it's not serious. You just said it, you didn't mean it. But what you need to remember is how that affects the person that has been said to, and how they've dealt with that throughout their whole lives. So it's incredibly important to remember that, therefore, that almost all students of color are experiencing some form of racial trauma. And unaddressed trauma leads to a number of mental and physical health issues. There's been multiple research papers done into this, but of course, due to time, can't really go into those in depth, but hopefully in our wider workshop, this will be explored a lot more. So it's incredibly important to understand the context in which our students of color are attending university, both in a broader sense and within university as well, and to understand that this affects them incredibly. And of course, we need to remember as well that in addition to all of that a student of color is facing, they're also facing the general difficulties that other students are facing. So of course, we know that when students come to university, they face high levels of stress, loneliness, and isolation. With disproportionate rates, and when we apply that to students of color, we understand that they can feel those at a disproportionate higher level than the general student population, particularly if they are the only person of color on their course, because this leads to a reduced sense of belonging, ostracization, and discrimination. Of course, we know that institutionally, the universities uphold the system of whiteness in terms of, if we look at our senior leadership, who are our senior leadership? They tend to be white men and maybe one white woman. And in a few universities is brown women, or brown men, never a brown woman, or very rarely a brown woman, and almost never a Black woman or a Black man. So how does this translate to students of color? It translates to them feeling as if they don't belong in that space. And can therefore really affect their mental health. It's also important to remember, like I mentioned earlier, that this is where I'm talking about a small snapshot in a wider issue, because we need to remember the link between how people of color tend to be from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, they tend to be working class, they tend to be they tend to be more likely to be the first to come to university from their families. We also cannot ignore intersectionality in terms of LGBT people of color and women of color, and the stacked oppressions that they face, and how when people are dealing with sexism, they're also dealing with racism. They cannot be unintertwined. And it's important to remember all of that and to not ever separate a student from the issues that they are facing, because when we do that, we're dealing with a fragmented person and not the whole person. So in terms of bringing it together and what this means for universities, a report by the OFS specifically into students with mental health conditions found that there's an exacerbated attainment gap for students with mental health conditions, in which Black students were 26.8% less likely to achieve a 2-1 or a first than their white counterparts. This highlights a systemic problem and a failure of university support systems to be properly supporting students of color, particularly Black students. Because white students with mental health issues were still able to attain a 2-1 or a first, whereas Black students were 26.8% less likely to. And this is, like I said, exacerbated from the overall attainment gap, which is 26%. This is also replicated in continuation rates, in which only 77.1% of Black students continued onto their first year. This is incredibly disconcerting when we look particularly at the fact that from 2013-14, continuation rates for full-time students of all ethnic groups improved, apart from Black students. And this shows that there is an issue with the support being put in place for Black students, and again highlights the incredible, the importance that is needed when looking specifically at the most marginalized students, so in this case Black students, and the way the university's support systems are not supporting them and not helping them how they should be. I just want to say as well, tomorrow my co-founder Oge will be doing a presentation specifically on how to support Black students. So I'd very much recommend going to that so you can understand more about the disproportionate effect of institutional racism on Black students, and the effect of the attainment gap on them, and how you can best support them in your institutions. So now, obviously, after outlaying that and understanding that there are incredible disparities in general at university context, but in particular, even within a support context, and when it comes to supporting students of color and their mental health, but Black students particularly and their mental health, there's an issue. And the issue likely lies in support services. And we now need to talk about, obviously, the importance of decolonizing support services and ensuring that they are truly inclusive. So it's of vital importance that we work to diversify, but beyond diversify, ensure that our support services have specific support for Black students, and specifically look at race and racial trauma and the way this affects their students. Because without that, you're not dealing properly with the student and all the issues that they face. I think a quote by Charles Embler really aptly puts the importance of this when he says that one does not have to operate with great malice to do great harm. The absence of empathy and understanding are sufficient. So when there is an absence of empathy and understanding within the very support systems that are supposed to help our students of color, in particular our Black students, but aren't even addressing the very important and integral parts of racial trauma and racism and the effects of them on our students of color, and how can we expect students to be properly supported? And if anything, these systems are actually reproducing harm to our students. The need for improved services, particularly in terms of support, was highlighted by, of course, the UUK and NUS's Closing the Gap report. And when asking students what they thought the main causes of the attainment gap were, 48% of students said that they felt it was institutional support systems. Of course, when we talk about support, it goes beyond just counselling and does also involve our support systems of our students of colour getting support from their lecturers how they should be. Are they getting support from personal tutors how they should be? And the highest reasons for that students felt the attainment gap existed was a lack of diverse senior leaders, as mentioned earlier, and lack of role models. So of course, when we translate this then back into the counselling room and support services in general, the whiteness of the service is a reason that students of colour may not be accessing the services as much. So despite the fact that students of colour suffer at a disproportionate rate from these mental health issues and everything they deal with on a daily basis exacerbates their mental health issues, they're also less likely to receive help. And that can be shown by the exacerbated attainment gap between Black students and white students, and the rate of continuation for Black students being so low as well. And what we need to do is ensure that our services are inclusive and representative of all of our students, so that they feel that they can access these services better and with more confidence. And also it's important to understand that when it comes to decolonizing, and as I said before about questioning where things come from, understanding where counselling comes from and whether counselling truly works for our students of colour. Sometimes it does, and that's wonderful, but students of colour may also benefit from alternative support, such as support groups, having specific safe spaces for students of colour in order for them to be amongst people who have similar experiences, but for that room to be headed by a professional who understands the effects of racial trauma and how to best support students of colour. So what can be done in terms of improving upon these disparities and actually supporting our students of colour? How can we support them, and what can you lobby for as a union? Of course, there are several different things that you can do, but as I'm bringing this workshop to a close, I'm just going to focus on a few. So one of the first steps is, of course, as I've highlighted throughout the workshop, the importance of cultural competency, and the importance of having a culturally competent counselling, but also wider support service. So as we talked about earlier, cultural competency is not just understanding the cultures of students and how that affects them, but also always and constantly examining our own biases, and examining how that affects our practice. So within institutions and within support services, there are a number of organizations that offer training specifically on cultural competency, and how to best have a culturally competent service. And it's it's paramount that there is a knowledge of racial trauma and its manifestations and how best to support this in counselling services. Because as mentioned, if a student is to go to counselling and they're talking about issues, but that issue is dealt with outside the realms of their race, and when they live a racialized experience, everything that they do is affected by their race and by racism, and the fact that almost every single student of colour has experienced a level of racial trauma, then that counselling service is not going to be effective for that student. And we know this from talking to students and their recounts saying that a lot of the time they waste their sessions. As we know, counselling sessions are hard to come by anyway, and they waste their sessions explaining cultural ideals and cultural ideas and how that may affect them, when this knowledge should already be embedded into the service. So similar to that is ensuring that we hire counsellors of colour. So in lobbying your university to hire more counsellors of colour, to maybe put aside a direct pot of money for hiring counsellors of colour, and because these people will have direct understanding and lived experience of the students of colour and understand them better. And of course, training will also help counsellors of colour, but they'll already have that base knowledge and base understanding, and it will also help for people of colour to access the service more. So you'll hopefully have an improved rate for students of colour. I think it's incredibly important as well to highlight that we, in particular, due to the fact that Black students are disproportionately affected, we need to ensure that we're lobbying for Black counsellors. I know when I was lobbying the university for counsellors of colour, we hired quite a few brown counsellors, particularly South Asian counsellors, but they just were not putting in the effort to find Black counsellors. And that this is a necessity from the fact that we've seen the disproportionate rates of that this affects students of colour, that this affects Black students, and how their mental health isn't cared for as well as white students and other ethnic groups as well. Another really important one that can be done both at the university and the union is, of course, ensuring that you have appropriate avenues for reporting racism, and this is racism in all its forms. So if a student reports a microaggression, is this taken as seriously as if they were called something derogatory, straight to their face? Because microaggressions, as we've highlighted, are an incredibly serious problem that needs to be addressed and helped. So are there appropriate reporting avenues for students? And when they're reporting, is there subsequent support for them? If not, ensuring that there's that support for them, so they're not just reliving their trauma with no help and no support in the meantime of that report going through its processes. Of course, lobbying doesn't just stop at the university. The union can do a lot as well, and it can do many things, of which we'll outlay a lot more in our whole presentation. But within this small one, one very, very important one is investing in your societies of colour. Societies of colour being cultural societies such as ACS, but also religious societies such as Islamic society, because that is mostly people of colour. Because these are places where when students come to university, they find belonging and they find comfort and support. So many students feel more supported by their societies than they do by other services that are supposed to support them. And you'll find that many societies will also do specific things about mental health and stuff. So it's important to invest in that and ensure that you're putting proper funding towards ensuring that societies are able to put on such events to support those students of colour, and that you are communicating with them and supporting them. You know, a lot of societies and universities, unions, have an issue with grant funding, and you'll find that societies of colour struggle to access grant funding more than other white and non-cultural societies. So this is another issue that needs to be addressed. And most importantly, beyond just practical steps and what to do, it's so important to listen to students of colour's experiences, listen to their concerns. If a student of colour approaches you as an officer, as a staff member, listen to what they're saying. If you don't understand where they're coming from, try to understand, try to learn, and absolutely never invalidate their experiences. So if a student of colour is experiencing racism, never ever invalidate that. And that doesn't always even necessarily mean you verbally invalidate them, but your processes may invalidate them. So when your processes fail them and they don't get due outcomes for when they've reported racism or other forms of discrimination, then that's a failure on the system's part to support them. And this is why students of colour often won't even report racism, because they don't think it will be taken seriously. So students will often just take on the racism until it has a detrimental effect on them, because they don't think it will be taken seriously. So it's incredibly important that we never invalidate a student's experience. It's important as well to involve them in key decisions. So when you're in those meetings with your senior management team, ensuring that you've spoken to students of colour and you've sought them out. And spoken to them, especially the most marginalized, speaking to Black students, understanding what they need and what they want. So when you're understanding students of colour's needs, this could just be a meeting you have with them, but sometimes universities and unions love a focus group. And I have to really, really emphasize here that if you use students of colour's experiences to better understand their needs, you need to compensate them for their labour. And this needs to be done through either finance or counselling, because you're making them relive trauma. And the final thing is for everybody in a union and any sort of organisation, and constantly in our own lives, our professional lives, and our personal lives, is just to actively learn and unlearn, especially if you're called out by a student. You may get defensive, and it's important to not get defensive and instead understand where they're coming from, and constantly be learning and unlearning your behaviour and what you think and what you know. So just in terms of like some more from us as Minds of POC, as mentioned earlier, we are a developmental consultancy service, and we are focused on the improvement of mental health support for people of colour. Our mantra is that in order to achieve better mental health for people of colour, we need to get to the root of those problems. In other words, tackling racism, white supremacy, and a capitalist society that continues to fail them and not support them. So what sort of services do we offer? We offer consultations, kind of race equity consultations, support consultations, training and workshops. So one of the workshops we offer is this workshop, but in a much more in-depth and lengthy manner. So this was only half an hour, maybe a bit over, I apologise. But our general one is 2 hours. And we also offer other workshops, such as a guide to supporting Black students, as well as identifying microaggressions, understanding institutional racism, and a number of other workshops. So if you ever want to know any more about our services, please get in touch with us either through our social media or by emailing us. But yeah, that's all from me for today. Thank you so much for listening. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask.
Brilliant, a whirlwind tour there. You're an absolute font of knowledge. We've had one question in the question and answer box from an attendee. They're asking, are other minorities such as Hispanic classed as people of colour?
So when it comes to Hispanic, if they come from Spain, it tends to be that their class is European. However, if they come from Latin America, then yes, they are people of colour. So people who are Mexican, Cuban, Puerto Ricans, they count as people of colour. I should really adapt the definition to include them, but yeah.
Okay, that's really good to know, thank you. We're being asked if, by Miriam, do you have a website that has details of the services?
So we're currently working on developing a website. We're quite a new service because Oge and I both just finished our terms as officers and then decided to start this service. So at the moment, we only have our social media. and our email, but we will very soon be putting out a website. But we will be putting out kind of a graphic about all the things we offer on our social media soon, so that will give you some more information on what we offer. And
a website will come a lot quicker if your services are procured, I'm sure. So
yeah.
those of you that are officers and staff in here, you know, we've got some brilliant consultants here that are offering some real in-depth knowledge that you wouldn't necessarily be able to have internally. It's great to lever them into your organizations. Think about how you can access them through existing budgets and things, so that we can try and get this knowledge into our unions and make them great places for people to study. We've got another question around how can one get involved in Minds of People of Colour? Sounds like you were doing some amazing things.
Oh, thank you. I think if you want to get involved, honestly, hire us. That's the best way for you to get involved. Share our stuff, get the word out there for us. And if you ever have any ideas of like kind of workshops you'd like us to deliver, or any specific things on like how we can improve our service, let us know, get in touch with us. Hopefully when we get the capacity to, we'll increase and involve more people. But obviously at the moment, as quite a new organization, we're kind of just focusing on building it at the moment.
Brilliant. We've had a couple more come in. If you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the box. Do you have any resources for finding people of colour counsellors for students?
Yes, definitely. There are a number of kind of networks that exist. The Black, Asian, African Therapist Network is one. There's a Muslim Counsellors Network, which is another. There are so those are the two main ones. The BAATN is what it's called. It's a very, very popular one. In terms of when it comes to hiring counsellors of colour, what we did that worked at Leicester was question where your university is putting the job advertisements. Often the university will just put it on the website, or perhaps somewhere a different hiring website, and what they need to be doing is putting it absolutely everywhere that they can, on LinkedIn, on Indeed, on Reed. Every single kind of hiring website that you use to find jobs, the university should be putting it on there as well. And I found that when we did that, it increased our ability to find counsellors of colour. But in terms of if you wanted to reach out to anybody, those two networks are really good. And there are other ones as well that exist. And there's a lot of organisations too that exist in terms of delivering kind of cultural competency training. So if you just get in touch with us, we can signpost you to those organisations.
Rumsey, apologies if I've pronounced your name wrong, asks, please can you provide more information about racial trauma? And they're from Birmingham City University Students' Union.
Yeah. So like I mentioned within this, so this workshop is just a kind of a whistle-stop tour of a far bigger workshop. So we are delivering a bigger workshop where we will talk so much more about what racial trauma is, how that manifests, and what that means, how you can support people who are dealing with racial trauma. So if you want to know more, I definitely recommend hiring us. And also I'd recommend the book, My Grandmother's Hands, and learning more, which takes you through exactly what racial trauma is, how, you know, the manifestations of that, where it comes from, and all those sort of things. So I could go into more, but I feel like, you know, we're running out of time. So I think those are some good things just to go to understand more. And yeah.
So there are 4 quick ones here. Well, I say they're quick, they're short in question, but probably long in answer. How can the institution test the cultural competency of their already hired counsellors?
Mm-hmm.
And then you've touched slightly on this already. How can we better advertise inclusive support to students of colour, especially in the meantime when we have predominantly white counsellors?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just going to give you those 2,
Yeah.
and then we've got 2 more.
Yep. So in terms of reviewing kind of cultural competency already, I think a good way to do that is to, one, obviously there are organisations out there that can help you understand that, and 2, look at your access rates. So if you're able to, you know, submit a freedom of information request or meet with head of wellbeing and ask them who's accessing the service. and kind of look at if there's a disparity between an immense number of white people accessing the service and not a lot of people of colour, there's an issue there that there isn't really cultural competency within your service, because why is there such a disparity between the access? As well, I think a good way is honestly that training. So if you implement that training and your counsellors are already knowledgeable about the things that are being said, then you do have a good level of cultural competency. But of course, we can always all learn more. I think as well, if you are in the process of hiring new counsellors, always have a question in there that kind of asks them about how they would deal with, therapeutically deal with maybe racial trauma, or a Black or brown student that's come to them with a specific issue, and see if they understand the issues of attainment, of racism and all that sort of stuff. In that way, you are hiring more culturally competent counsellors. But yeah, for the ones that already exist, the rates of access and kind of making sure you get that training in is a very good way. And the second question was about advertising inclusivity in white counselling, right? So I think a really good way to. Oh.
So yeah, just for clarity, it was how can we better advertise inclusive support for students of colour, especially in the meantime when we have predominantly white counsellors?
So if you've got predominantly white counsellors, I wouldn't try to front and say that you are an inclusive service if those white counsellors don't already have knowledge around how to support students of colour, racial trauma, and all that sort of stuff. I'd recommend instead you put together a comprehensive list of external services that students can access, or you ensure that you're taking the steps to make sure that your existing counselling services are culturally competent. When it's a white service, there's nothing to say that white services can't also be culturally competent. It's just that those counsellors need to constantly be checking themselves and ensuring they're increasing their knowledge around how to support students of colour. But in terms of showing yourselves as more inclusive, it would be showing that you're doing the work. So show that you're trying to hire more counsellors of colour, show that the existing counsellors are going under training right now. And for anybody that does have any counsellors of colour, I'd recommend kind of wherever you can access counselling on the university website, having pictures of your counsellors there. It's a good way to be transparent with your students about who's counselling them, and a good way for them to reach out to specific counsellors if they need help.
Some great top tips there. Penny Din is asking, as a psychology graduate, do you think your psychology training prepared you for how to support BAME clients?
Nope, not at all. So psychology is something that definitely needs to be decolonized and made more inclusive. And it's something that I, as a psychology graduate and aspiring clinical psychologist, really want to work towards, because even clinical psychology has attainment issues and massive disparities between white and Black students. Yes, short answer is no.
Okay, that's I mean, there's that two prong there, isn't there? The making sure that your counsellors are a diverse group of people, and also making sure that as an institution you are working with your psychology departments to make sure that they are developing their curricula to be inclusive as well. Sophie Hartley says, how do you advise lobbying the university to hire people of colour counsellors when they suggest they do not have the funding to do so?
Okay, so when the university come back to you with, we don't have the funding, they definitely have the funding, they're just not putting it in the right places. So I had this issue as well, and my predecessor, Oge, and my fellow co-founder, before I was wellbeing officer, she was wellbeing officer, and she was lobbying for culturally competent and inclusive health, mental health care systems at university for a long time. And the way you have to do it is honestly by using their language, talking about like NSS results, talking about outcome rates, talking about the attainment gap, kind of everything that was outlined here, outline that to them, talk about how your students of colour are being failed at the university by the university, talk about how this is a priority issue, and they should be prioritising this issue above all else, because this will help increase the university's inclusivity, increase its sense of belonging, and as the university loves the NSS, that it will ultimately increase NSS as well. But yeah, speaking the university's language is a good way to do that, and just understanding that they definitely do have funding, but they're just saying they don't. So this is another thing that we go into more detail in our workshop as well, about kind of how to successfully lobby your university too. But those are kind of some quick tips.
Yeah, and also remember, students' unions have their own advice services, and they should also be following some of these top tips as well.
Yep.
Again, apologies if I pronounced your name wrong. Grianne has written, the north of Ireland is 98% white. and often we raise the need to hire more people of colour in senior management and counselling services. We're met with the argument they simply can't find them. How can we combat this argument?
Yeah, this is again an argument I got so much. Oh, it's so hard to find them, we can't find them. And it's the thing again of, well, they're there, you're just not obviously putting in the right effort. And when they say they can't find them, ask them, okay, what have you done so far to try and find them? And if you get an answer back that's very like, well, we put a job out and no one applied for it, well, then they need to understand that obviously these institutions are known for being perpetuators of whiteness and violence. So people are less likely to try and get hired by them. So what you need to do as well is when you're hiring, so a good thing to do is obviously when you see on applications, people saying like, we welcome applications from people, people of color, LGBT people, etc. Putting that on an application is a good way to do it. I think what we did during our hiring process was putting on as well within like desirable characteristics, saying that someone who had lived experiences of kind of racism and issues affecting students of color, and then that way you're directly asking for a person of color. And then again, in terms of that thing of where they put the advertisement, so it's just very much questioning them. So like, have you done this, have you done this? If not, we should be doing this, and saying, you know, that they exist there, but we just haven't put the right effort in. And it's just kind of honestly just kind of staying on their necks, just constantly keep on top of them, making sure they're doing everything that they can be, because universities are renowned for being lazy. They won't do things unless they can see a benefit to them doing it. So if they don't see a benefit to them doing it, they won't put the effort in to do it. So you just have to really, really lobby and kind of take those angles to be like, I don't think you have tried hard enough. Here's some ways we can try. And also kind of just searching for networks. Maybe in Northern Ireland, there are kind of councils of colour networks that exist, getting in touch with people, you know, those sort of networks, and they can put you in touch with the right people, that sort of stuff.
That's great tips. And then the final three I'm going to take together because I think they can be answered in a group. So the first one is from a union that uses the word BAME, collective, and whether or not they should be reconsidering that term, and what would you recommend? How would you assist white students to understand people of colour's struggles, and how can we get involved in more of your workshops?
Okay. Awesome. So for the first one, in terms of using BAME, obviously it's a sector widely used word and acronym. So if you did want to work towards moving away from it, I think there's not necessarily an issue in using it in terms of if somebody's understanding what you're trying to say. So when you're talking to senior management, they understand what you're trying to get when you say BAME. What I would recommend is whenever you're using that, address the issues that lie within using BAME. So the fact that it's a homogenizing term, the fact that sometimes it can include white ethnic groups, and the fact that in that way you're not being able to properly support particularly Black students, and where the most marginalized students are, because you're using a homogenizing term. Obviously people of color is still a homogenizing term, but it kind of moves away from including people that shouldn't be included in the group. So kind of taking that sort of angle could help. But if you're not able to move away from BAME, just addressing the issues with it whenever you're talking about it, and being transparent with the fact that you don't think this is the best term, but for now, in terms of ease of communication and understanding, it's what you'll use. I think the second one was, what was the second one again? Sorry.
How do we assist white students to understand people of colour's struggles?
Okay, so I think a really good way is kind of through education and through events. And you know, having events specifically about how people of colour's mental health is affected at university. You'll find that often white students will disengage from things like that. So maybe they won't come to the events, but maybe putting things around campus, putting kind of have a visual campaign with kind of statistics on students of colour's mental health. How this is affected, having kind of a visual campaign to educate white students about how microaggressions are harmful and stuff like that, kind of pique their interest with maybe a visual thing, and then having events where hopefully with their information, with their, you know, with the interest gauged and peaked, they'll come to the events hopefully to learn more. But it is definitely difficult to engage, especially white students who don't want to learn. It's difficult to engage them, but there's definitely a lot of students who do want to learn and just need that space to learn. So just ensuring that you're putting on those events, marketing it out to as many students as you can, kind of having that visual aspect as well, so people can see what you're doing. And then in terms of the last one, how to get involved with our workshops, honestly, just email us. email us with any interest you have in a particular workshop. Like I said, with this one, we're delivering this to students' unions at the moment. So if you'd like us to deliver this to your students' union, to the rest of your officer team, and you'd like to learn about this in more detail, or even to any student leaders as well, we'd be happy to do that. And if you just contact us at our email on the screen there, we'll be sure to respond to you with the details of how to book and pricing and everything. Or you could, just DM us on Twitter or Instagram, and we'll get in touch with you on how, what sort of workshop you're looking for and when we can deliver it and everything. We're very flexible.
Super. And do that, everyone, because come on, look, it's very rare that we find a former sabbatical officer coming in at a key moment in the journey of higher education and the civil rights movement with such a brilliant offer. So, we all are worried a little bit about next year's budgets, but this is something that is really crucial to so many of our students, and we owe it to them. And if you can, support an alumni of the movement, why not at the same time? Thank you so much for your presentation today. I learned a lot. There was lots of great engagement from everyone here today. And do all follow on Twitter and Instagram, Minds of POC. It's a great thing for you to be able to tap into, and when you've got someone who understands the student movement so intimately because they've been an officer, it's just going to make things a lot easier. Thank you all so much for coming along. Have a safe rest of your week and see you all soon.
Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.